I suppose, like me, 2 days ago when summer arrived, you drew back your curtains and opened the window and cried, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." You might have even sung, "Oh, what a beautiful day." And I, throughout most of my life, had always assumed that this expression, "Oh, what a beautiful morning, oh, what a beautiful day," was deep in English folklore or something like that. But this isn't the case. March the 31st, the first day of the Passover, for some of you here, the first Easter Saturday for us heathens, was the 75th birthday of the first time "Oh, what a lovely morning, oh, what a beautiful day" was ever heard in public. It was, of course, by Oscar Hammerstein and Richard Rogers. Oscar Hammerstein was only half Jewish. He was raised as an Episcopalian. But to my mind, one of the most powerful vectors in the civilization that we have is having a Jewish component. I am not being patronizing when I say 2 Jews are better than 1 Jew and 2 Jews are infinitely better than 2 Gentiles. I actually believe that as a historical fact. That's why the Jews have made so much contributions to the peoples of the world. But Richard Rogers was of German Jewish origin. And Jews have, in the 20th century, one way or another, filled the imaginations of the Western world with their music. Now, as you know, in the 18th and 19th century, there were few enough Jewish composers, the Meyerbeer, the Mendelssohns, later there was Mahler. And the great music, Handel, Bach, Beethoven and Brahms, they're not Jewish composers. But how we have heard them in the past 50 or 60 years is through the skills and the musicality of Jewish composers, or Jewish performers, I'm sorry. The violin, the most difficult instrument of all to play, has been mastered most superbly, generally by Jews: Maxim Vengerov, Yashiv Heifetz, David and Igor Oistrakh, Yehudi Menuhin, Isaac Stern, and Joshua Bell. If you deduct these from the violin players of the last 50 years, there's not much left to speak of, and the same is true of the piano. The greatest pianist in the world today is an Argentinian woman, Martha Argerich. There's Vladimir Horowitz, Yevgeny Kissin, Vladimir Ashkenazi, Daniel Barenboim, Andras Schiff, and Arthur Rubinstein. Music is not just about technical accomplishment. Any one of us can manage the technical requirements to play an instrument if you put enough practice in. Practice, of course, is necessary, essential. But the real power of music comes from the heart. It is an emotional component that cannot be feigned, it cannot be falsified. It is genuine, it's authentic. The most beautiful piece of music that comes to my mind is the Bach's double concerto in D for 2 violins. This requires melancholy, symmetry, harmony, and empathy. And of all the double concertos that I've heard, ever heard, every single one of them has been by 2 Jews. The most important of all, in my mind, perhaps the greatest recording of all time, is by David and Igor Oistrakh, who were Ukrainian or Crimean Jews, father and son. They had an empathy that came from their family, and they had an empathy that came from thousands of hours of practice. So the music that we have in our mind, the music that we remember, although written perhaps by Gentiles a century or more ago, has been created within our lifetimes by Jews. And then we come to the 20th century, to the great musicals upon which so many of our musical memories depend. And you know these names. Stephen Sondheim, Leonard Bernstein, Richard Rodgers, I've mentioned, Jerome Kern, Lorenz Hart, Alan J. Lerner, Frederick Lowe, Dorothy Fields, not well known, but one of the greatest lyricists of the 20th century, John Kander, whose name probably isn't known to you, but he wrote the music for Cabaret, and Erwin Michnik, Man of La Mancha. He wrote the music for Man of La Mancha. All of these are American Jews. Lionel Bart was an English Jew. These have created, within Western civilization, a body of musicality that could not be matched by any ethnic group, whether in majority or the minority. That is to say, our perception of music is almost entirely dependent on Jews. It's not a monopoly, but the most important single vector in the creation of the musical imagination of the Western world has been people of Jewish extraction. Now, I'm not saying that they're all practicing Jews, but they had Jewish parents or grandparents that creates the moral vector that allows people to achieve excellence that they wouldn't have. And I do believe this, that Jewishness is essentially an issue of morality. Those 620 moral injunctions that you have in the mitzvahs. It is 620, isn't it? 630. 627 plus 3, is that right? 613. 613.
You're doing too many.
Okay. I believe that's a primary component in the creation of Jewishness and Jewish loyalty and Jewish integrity. One of the features about American Jewish contribution to America is the way Jews engage with other ethnic groups. Irving Berlin is the celebrated creator of ragtime as is understood by people not of African origin. He was the one who heard Africans playing, African Americans playing ragtime and translated it for the broader American community. Irving Berlin is interesting in many, many regards, and he would merit a place by himself for an entire talk. But he is best known around the world for the fact that he wrote the most recorded, the most listened to, the best-selling record of all time, White Christmas. Now, White Christmas is really unusual. Unlike almost any other Christmas song, it's not upbeat, and it's not reverential. Why is this? Now, this is a theory of my own. I haven't read it anywhere. Irving Berlin had a very tragic life. I mean, he escaped from oppression in Russia, and his first wife contracted typhus on their honeymoon and died. He married, again, an Irish girl, Ellen Mackey. He wasn't Orthodox or practicing. And on the December 1st, 1928, they had a son, Irving Jr. And Irving Jr. died on Christmas Day, that same December. The child's 25 days old. Jews here would know this term, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. A song of respect for the dead, the Yitzchak. I believe in the back of his mind that Irving Berlin, when he wrote White Christmas, had a Yitzchak in mind for his son, the boy who died aged 25 days. He wrote White Christmas 13 years later. It was first performed on Christmas Day, precisely 13 years after his death. This is the month that he would have had his bar mitzvah. So, even if it wasn't conscious, I believe the White Christmas is a declaration of love for a lost son. And what else is the linen on a boy's crib but white? And what colour is his coffin but white? Now, that's a theory of my own. But just as Irving Berlin engaged with black Americas, it was once called African Americas, we perhaps call it today, so too did George Gershwin with Porgy and Bess, which is one of the great operas of the 20th century, could arguably be said to be the greatest opera of the 20th century. But George Gershwin wasn't alone amongst the Jewish composers who reached out to other communities. Oscar Hammerstein wrote the lyrics for, and Jerome Kern wrote the music for Old Man River. It wouldn't be permissible these days, I think, for somebody of non-African American origin to write a lament or a tribute to the realities of African American life to slavery. But it was then. And that was the thing that defined the Jewish contribution to America from its early days. Jews reached out in the way that the Irish and the Italians and the WASPs didn't. They were interested in other traditions within the American way. They also did something else too. Their musicals that they wrote, of the names that I've given to you early on, you know, Richard Rodgers and Frederick Lowe and Alan J. Lerner and Lawrence Hart and so on, they dealt with serious issues. Oklahoma, with which I began this talk, ends in the killing of a troublesome farmhand. Carousel is all about marital abuse. The King and I are about racial prejudice. And The Sound of Music ends in The Final Solution. It's a reasonable question to ask why it is that Jews, and almost only Jews, apart from Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, have created the musical form and have almost totally monopolized it. But the great exception to the American Jewish musical is Les Miserables. It was originally written for the French market by Michel Schonberg, who is of Hungarian Jewish extraction, and Alan Boublil, who is Tunisian Sephardic. Cameron McIntosh, who is not Jewish, the London impresario, felt that it wasn't quite suited for the London market, so he had it reconstructed by Herbert Kretschmer, who is a South African of Lithuanian Jewish origin. We have almost a monopoly on an art form here that I think is unparalleled in civilization, and it's a monopoly based entirely on intellect and talent. And it has no further explanation than that. It is self-explanatory. The best get to the top. In 1952, two teenage boys were approached by the manager of an African-American singer called Big Mama Thornton. They wanted, the two of them, wanted, Big Mama Thornton and her manager wanted a new song that was going to shape her career, do something for her career. She was then singing in Los Angeles. And these two Jewish boys, they were 18 at the time, used to make it their business to go to black clubs and listen to music. Their name were Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. They were Jewish. The tune they wrote for Thornton was Hound Dog. You can get it on YouTube. It's rhythm and blues. Straightforward rhythm and blues. Written by these two teenage Jews. 4 years later, it was picked up by Elvis Presley. He turned it into rock and roll and transformed the world of music in the way that no individual had ever done that before. No one has ever achieved the earth-shaking impact on world music that Elvis Presley did with that single Jewish song. And that wasn't the only Jewish contribution to Elvis Presley. The great hits he wrote in the 1950s, which transfixed the world, which changed young people's perceptions of themselves and their relationship with the world, the most important of these were written by Jews. Jailhouse Rock, King Creole, Treat Me Nice, Trouble, and She's Not You. Then he went to serve in the US Army, returned, and picked up more songs by two other Jews, Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann, Messer Blues, Little Sister, Surrender, Suspicion. At that point, in New York, there was a place called the Brill Building, where large numbers, too many of me to mention here, of Jewish musicians were writing. Amongst them was a very young Burt Bacharach. Other Jewish musicians or composers are a little less easy to identify by their names. For example, the writer who went by the name Ralph Ranger, his real name was Ralph Reichenthal. Randy Starr, who wrote 12 songs for Elvis, his real name was Warren Nadell, and he was a dentist in New York. Bill Giant, a great Jewish name, he wrote a dozen songs for Elvis also, and his real name was Harvey Zimmerman. And one songwriter was Bob Hilliard, but his real name was Hilliard Goldsmith. Norman Mead was known to his parents as Jerry Ragavoy. Cal Mann, who wrote Let's Twist Again, was really David Friedman. Jay Livingston, who wrote Mona Lisa and Whatever Will Be, was actually Jacob Levinson. I've gone through the Presley songbook. He recorded 665 songs. 41% were by Jews, or co-written by Jews. 274, that is to say. 41%. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I took a year at random. The year I took was 1990. I went through the Billboard Top 100. There were 22 number ones in 1990. It was also 41% written by Jews. I can't explain that, it's uncanny. I mentioned at the very beginning that the Big Mama Thornton, she sang in rhythm and blues style, and Elvis Presley sang in rock and roll. The term rock and roll was invented by Alan Freed, whose father was a Jew. The term rhythm and blues was invented by Jerry Wexler, who was also Jewish. He was 100% Jewish. Now, I'm not going to tell you that Johnny Cash is really Jacob Goldstein. But I'm going to tell you this. The Library of Congress in Washington has a clear establishment point for country and Western music. It's from a series of recordings that were done in 1927 by Victor Records. They recorded songs of the Appalachians in the way that had never been done before. Victor Records was founded by Emil Berliner, who was Jewish, and the chief executive at the time of the recordings was Nathaniel Shikret, who was also Jewish. And of course, Bob Dylan, who founded an entire genre of music by himself, is actually Robert Zimmerman, needless to say, Jewish also. I did tell you that the Jews in America are different from other ethnic groups in the way that they reached out to other groups. I think it's only decent and fair and right at this point to remind you of 3 civil rights workers who were killed murdered, by the Ku Klux Klan in 1964. One of them was James Chaney, an African American, and the other 2 were Mickey Schwirmer and Andrew Goodman, both Jewish boys, American patriots. Whenever we think of the price that is being paid for freedom, we might bear these 3 names in mind. Whereas it's perfectly logical and for James Chaney to have done what he did defending his own people, these 2 boys went down from New York to Mississippi and laid down their lives there. Never to be forgotten. Now, we all know about the role of Jews in Hollywood. There have been no great studios that have been run by Gentiles, to speak of, that have made a major contribution to cinema to compare with the Jews. And the film industry in America began in New Jersey, and it began entirely with Gentiles, so that the people who succeeded in Hollywood did so by talent alone. Now, that's a huge essay. 100 volumes could be written about Jews and Hollywood. But I decided at random, without any pre-preparation, without any particular knowledge, to look at films that I particularly liked. And this is a genuine result. I did not go looking for films to which Jews have made contribution. Singing in the Rain is the classic film musical. It was directed by Stanley Donen, who was Jewish. His music by Lenny Hayton, who was Jewish. The screenplay was by Betty Cohen and Adolph Green, who were Jewish. Produced by Arthur Freed, who was Jewish. I didn't know any of that. I didn't know any of that before I went looking for it. The Wizard of Oz originally wasn't written by a Jew, but it was made into the most influential film in the history of cinema, in the sense that there's hardly a child in the world hasn't had their musical perceptions and their perceptions of the world and the world of magic changed and influenced, enhanced and enriched by that film. The lyricist was Yip Harburg, who also wrote Buddy, Can You Spare Me a Dime? With Jay Gormy, who's born Abraham Jacob Gonetsky, and Harold Arlen wrote the music. He was the son of Hyman Arlick, the son of New York cantor. Groundhog Day, I think, is one of the most beautifully constructed films. I've seen it half a dozen times. I can watch it 1,000 times. It was written by Harold Ramis and Danny Rubin, and was directed by Ramis, and both men are Jews. The Usual Suspects was directed by Brian Singer, who was a Jew, and is a Jew. And to my mind, the greatest film in my lifetime is Chinatown, with the most perfect screenplay, a jewel of a screenplay, directed by Roman Polanski, who is Jewish, and written by Robert Town, who is Jewish. And if I had a vote amongst you now about which is the greatest film ever made, I suspect that Casablanca would come very high on the list. And you look at Casablanca and you say to yourself, how is that Jewish? Because there are no Peter Lorre is the only Jew on screen, and how is it in that sense? How that is possibly Jewish? And it's Jewish in a very subtle way. It gives you an explanation. When I tell you what I'm about to tell you, you will then understand why this film is different, why it's special. It was directed by Michael Curtis, born Mano Kamena, he was Jewish. Its producer was Hal Wallace, he was Jewish. But the important thing is the lesser parts. The lesser parts. They were almost all played by Jewish exiles from Europe. That was an essay about the righteousness of the war against the Third Reich. It was begun in America when America was neutral. It was filmed when America started the war. It actually hit the market, the cinemas, on the day that Casablanca was liberated by the Allies. It was blessed in that sense. It was written originally by a Jewish playwright called Murray Burnett. It was rewritten by Julius and Philip Epstein and Howard Koch. But the miracle of this play that was transformed into a film, is the lesser parts. There's an authenticity about this that cannot be feigned. These people are stating a truth about reality, that civilization is on the balance. And if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. I mean, for all time. And if you remember Casablanca, there's that woman who sings the Marseillaise. She's not Jewish. Her husband is. And they're exiles from France. They got out in time. I want to go back a few years now, back to 1918. on August the 8th, the world might commemorate, if it's not already tired of battles from the Great War, the greatest battle, and I don't say that any sign of approval, but it is the most definitive battle of the war, the Battle of Amiens, when 500 British tanks broke through German defences and began the process of what's called the 100 Days, which ended in the German defeat as the Hindenburg Line was broken in September 1918. And this battle was made possible largely by the influence, the power, the energy, the dynamism, the foresight of one man, Bertie Stern. Bertie Stern came from a banking family. Originally they were French bankers, had moved to England. He was a passionate Englishman. In later life he was to join the Church of England, but he is classically, for our purposes, a Jew. He tried to sign up at the moment war was declared into the British Army. He had a riding accident, so he failed the medical test. So he then pursued the Royal Navy, and there was a vacancy in the Royal Naval Air Service, which also ran armoured cars for protection of airfields and ports. And he saw in the armoured car the possibility of a way of breaking through the trench works that ran from Zurich to the North Sea, the most sinister architecture in the history of the world. He recognised, with a couple of inventors that he contacted, that there was a way of breaking this system. He had a greater vision than most of the people. Most of the people thought that the purpose of this new thing was originally called a land ship. Some people say that it was Stern who invented the word tank to cover as a camouflage, but it really doesn't matter. The Landship Committee, he appointed himself as secretary. He ran the Landship Committee. They decided whether this new machine was going to have big wheels or tracks, whether it would have a diesel engine or a petrol engine or a steam engine. All these were mechanical decisions which Stern supervised. But he uniquely saw this new landship or tank as a means not of crossing to no man's land, but breaking through all the way to Germany. He actually foresaw the possibility that this new weapon wasn't a tactical weapon, it was a strategic weapon. And his immediate contacts with the War Office in early 1915 indicated to him that it was no good dealing with civil servants. He had to have his own committee, which he virtually handpicked. He got officers in Pall Mall, which he personally paid for. He employed staff he personally paid for. And the reason why the tank was able to make its first appearance in 1916 was almost entirely because of Stern's energy and effort. Not content with that, he then insisted on new improvements and new forms of tank, so that by 1918, not merely had the British assembled 500 tanks which broke the German defences, he also introduced something entirely new which was not copied again until well into the Normandy campaign in 1944, and that was armoured personnel carriers. He had what was called the Mark V Star tank, which would carry troops across no man's land, so that they would be spared the horrors of munitions against bare flesh. A name that has been forgotten. And he wasn't a self-promoting man, and most of his work was undercover. He had a couple of vital assistants in this. The founder of Shell Oil was a man named Marcus Samuel. I don't need to tell you his ethnic background. He surrendered the interest of the company entirely to the British war effort. And he was the one, his chief executive was a man called Robert Whaley Cohen, who provided the fuel. All fuels that had been used by the tank were not working, they were knocking in the cylinders. He came up with the fuel that worked. That made the tank a possibility. And all these, and a vital man in 1915-16 was the Minister for Munitions, a man called Montague. Shall I tell you his ethnic background? No, I won't. It's not necessary. But these are the ones who made victory in 1918 possible. I'm not saying anything good about the First World War. It was unmitigated catastrophe for European civilization. But we who were here for the Balfour Declaration centenary will also recognize that the Jewish home came as a product of the Great War.